Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into the second version of Gigantic Brewing Company's most premium Russian Imperial Stout. This specific one is the rye whiskey barrel-aged version. As with the first, it clocks in at 12% ABV, and Gigantic Brewing is based in Portland, Oregon. So if you didn't catch the review, it was just a few reviews ago, I did the first version of this beer that I'm reviewing. They released a line of this exact same beer, most premium Russian Imperial Stout, but made the alteration of aging it in different barrels. So the first one we reviewed was the Scotch barrel-aged version, which I absolutely loved. Today is the rye whiskey-aged version. So in terms of label art on this one, it's identical to the last. It's got that same kind of praying mantis looking thing, holding up a goblet of beer whilst wearing kind of Imperial Russian Tsar looking regalia. So this is part of several different beers and brewers that I've got where they're taking the same beer but tweaking one thing about it. So I am really enjoying this. I love when brewers do this. It's very unique. It lets you really see just how big of a deal each tiny little change that you make to a beer makes to the overall beer drinking experience and completely changes various aspects of the beer. So here they're only changing the barrels. I'm not expecting a ton of variances here in terms of weight, in terms of mouthfeel, but I am indeed expecting different aromas and flavor profiles and even potentially link the finish and kind of nuances to pop out that way to take part. So this one, the rye, just as with the last, it's just got a little kind of paper tab over the cap here. I'm just gonna rip that, probably not even necessary, but we're gonna pry that right off. Yep, perfect. And we will get this poured right in the old stout glass again here. I imagine this one will, yep, quite thick, just as the last one. Last one didn't form a super great head since it was quite active in terms of carbonation, so I'm trying to give this one a better chance at forming one. Yeah, I mean it will, but it's gonna quickly go away just like the last one did. This, for a big Imperial Stout, is quite active in terms of carbonation, so those bubbles rushing up are really just kind of collapsing it from underneath as it's trying to form. Same as the last. I can tell you, just as with the last one, as soon as I get it poured, there is a very pronounced aroma coming off of this beer. So, visually, pitch black as expected. Let's get right up over it for a proper sniff. Oh yeah. Yeah, okay, so this smells absolutely fantastic. A lot of similarities to the first one that we tried, but noticeably, this is a completely different type of whiskey barrel. This is a rye whiskey barrel, not a Scotch whiskey barrel. So yes, there's still those underpinnings of very deeply roasted malt bill, just as came through on the first, and a big, very obvious spirit barrel aroma coming off of this one as well, but it does smell different. Different aromas for these different whiskeys. The Scotch one had almost these kind of peaty undercurrents and some different other aromatics that came through on this one. This one smells maybe a bit more boozy on the nose is probably the best way I could describe it, and the overall kind of aroma characteristics coming off of it are obviously different. Of course, they're both whiskey, so they do share commonalities, but one Scotch and one rye whiskey. So, already visually it looks the same, basically had the same head and retention, looked basically the same as I poured it out of the glass, but slightly different aroma. Let's jump right into this one and see exactly what this one tastes like. Oh, it's another very good beer. Okay, so we're going to talk texture on this one first. I don't remember exactly. I'll have to check my notes where I rated the weight on the first one, but this one feels medium heavy-ish, I would say. It doesn't feel quite as heavy or as weighty as you would expect for a 12% Russian Imperial Stout. That's for certain. It doesn't quite have that heft to it. It doesn't quite have the breadth that I would expect on a 12%. But it's not bad. It's just not as heavy as I expected. In terms of the mouthfeel, this one's very, very resistant. You can feel just a ton of viscosity and thickness to it as you agitate it around the palate. When you do agitate, this one really doesn't get creamy, doesn't get foamy, doesn't get silky, but you can really feel all of that resistance on this mouthfeel. It does have a very thick, resistant mouthfeel to be certain. Not quite as heavy of a body as I expected, but the mouthfeel's exactly where I expected. So, flavor profile. This one, the barrel really is the first thing that jumps out at you. And it does taste distinctly of whiskey. No question about it. There's some kind of barrel-like qualities that come through on this one as well. It's got a little bit of a woodiness to it. I don't remember, again, I'll have to check my notes. It's been a few reviews. I drink a lot of beers. If that quality was on the first one, but that is definitely coming through on here. And just as with the first, I remember this clearly from this base malt bill, very, very roasty. There was a ton of deep, richly roasted malt that comes through in this flavor profile. There's a nice underpinning of char. Nothing on this one do I think really taste coffee-like, which you often get with these big imperial stouts. But it's really just coming from pure roasty malt, and then the intensity of this flavor profile from this barrel, and then that woodiness. I don't remember that on the first, but it's definitely present here. It's very, very nice. In terms of the finish, I kind of feel like the first one might have been this way as well, but the finish is not as long on this beer as you would anticipate for a beer with that much thickness that has that big and bold and intensity of a push and rush of flavor up front. So it doesn't finish dry at all. It's not a dry finish. It is wet and round, but it doesn't really linger all over the palate quite as long as you might anticipate for a beer that's been barrel-aged of this type, and certainly in this ABV range. It doesn't really haunt on the back of the palate. It doesn't really linger. But where it does finish on the end of the finish on this one is really just the slightest suggestion still of that undercurrent of the roasty malt, and then the barrel is probably the most pronounced bit that lingers on the back to the end before it finally just dissipates to nothing. So overall, a very, very tasty beer, a very, very well-crafted Russian Imperial Stout to be certain. The barrel adds just this really big dynamic to the flavor and the aroma profile of this beer, just like with the first one, and it is a distinctly different flavor profile, and indeed aroma as well. So I'm going to jump back in for a second sip. I'm going to let everything re-intensify, make sure I didn't miss anything, and then we will see where we stand. Again, I don't remember exactly how the first one in all categories, I'll have to check my notes, kind of played, but I do see there's a lot of commonality here, but also some deviations. So take two. That's a big, bold flavor right up front. Big burst of that barrel. That rye whiskey really comes out at you. That roasty backbone really comes through clearly as well. I would say it's about 60-40 barrel to malt bill, kind of on the front for the first few seconds. Then they kind of back down and find even parity. So it's really equal parts barrel, really, and equal parts really deeply roasty, char-like malt. Very, very big beer. It's got a big kick up front. It's extremely pungent, hugely flavor forward. On second sip, again, these kind of wood-like notes that are coming through from the barrel are coming through. If anything, I would say this one probably has a bit more of an accentuation on the char side of the malt bill. Some of that could be coming from the barrel, to be certain, but a lot of that could be coming from this malt bill. But what I do know is it's absolutely tasty. And again, the finish, it really loses its intensity right around the 20 to 30 second mark, which is not a short amount of time. But for a 12% barrel-aged Imperial Russian Stout, it's still not quite as long as I would expect. And it really starts to quickly dissipate from there. So once you get near the minute, I'm guessing it's been close to a minute mark on each sip, the length of the finish really does dissipate almost to nothing. On second sip, it did re-intensify on this one, and there's a little bit more present barrel lingering on the back of the palate, but it's still nowhere near the intensity that you would expect on a typical 12% barrel-aged Imperial Stout. So there's a lot of interesting commonalities here between the first one and the second, but they are distinctly different beers. Sure, it's the same recipe, but that barrel does make a huge difference. And that's part of why I think this is so cool, and I love it when brewers do this. Let's take the same beer, but tweak one thing and see what happens. Well, it's a completely different beer drinking experience. Maybe not in all aspects, but there's definitely something new around each corner, and I absolutely love it. It's a real treat to explore. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, count my scores. When we come back, we'll get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, so now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was Gigantic Brewing Company's most premium Russian Imperial Stout. This is all 2021 releases of all the beers that are like this. This is the rye barrel aged version, 12% ABV, Gigantic based in Portland, Oregon. So there were some distinct differences, not just aroma and flavor, between this and the last version that we tried, though the scores did come out remarkably close. I think overall this one scored 1 point higher, but we'll go through them anyway. So starting with the aroma, just as with the first version we sampled, big, huge, massive aromas. You could really smell that rye whiskey barrel and also the really roasty underpinning of the malt bill. Had a lot of other different aromas that came out of it compared to the Scotch one. Obviously both whiskey, but distinctly different. And a really pungent aroma, smelled absolutely amazing. The aroma on this one gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste, I enjoyed the flavor profile on this one just as well as the Scotch barrel-aged version. Again, a lot of different nuances. On this one, I was getting a lot more kind of char and some more woody-like elements coming out of the barrel, as well as some subtle different kind of fruit that floated in and out. Very, very nice, just as with the first, big pungent roasty malt bill and a big burst of that barrel as well. The taste gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body on this one, again, as with the first, it wasn't as heavy as you would expect for the style, but this one did feel heavier than the Scotch barrel-aged version. For whatever reason, it did. I said this was high end of average. Body gets a 6 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, this was hugely resistant. I mean, just ridiculously resistant. You could feel how thick and viscous it was, just slight movement across the palate. Mouthfeel gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the finish, this one definitely had a longer than average finish, but again, it wasn't quite as long as I expected given the intensity of flavor up front and the fact it's a 12% barrel-aged beer. It didn't last quite as long in the back end as expected, but above average. Finish gets a 7 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one poured basically identical to the Scotch barrel version, not very well at all. Head and retention gets a 2 out of 10. For the appearance, this was textbook Imperial Stout, pitch black, 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was awesome, just as with the first. You know, really picking the right malt bill, the right hops, the right yeast strain, and picking a really good spirit barrel and leaving them in there the requisite amount of time. That's everything in a nutshell that goes into balancing a beer like this well, and they absolutely did it phenomenally. Balance, perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, subjectively, I loved it. I love a big Russian Imperial, and a barrel aged is just the icing on the cake. 10 out of 10. Finally, is an example of the style. So yes, just as with the first, there were a few categories where it lost a few points, and one notably the head and retention where it lost a ton. But just as with the first, I don't want to completely bash the beer because I do believe that this is a really great example of what a barrel-aged Russian Imperial Stout can be, and I think that they did a tremendous job. So I only docked 1 point overall. Example of the style gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Gigantic Brewing's most premium Russian Imperial Stout rye barrel-aged version to an 84 out of 100. So 1 point higher overall, some slightly different scores than on the Scotch barrel-aged version, but remarkably similar, albeit completely different beer drinking experiences, particularly in terms of aroma and flavor. So just as with the first, I would say, look, 84, yes, that's well above average, but you know, why would I grab that instead of something that's like a 95? Well, if we consider the head and retention only got a 2, it is what it is. Let's just pretend that it got perfect score, 10 out of 10. This is already deep into the 90s. So, I mean, it's hard to say, oh, well, it didn't form. It is what it is. I had to rank it how I experienced it, but it's really not that important in the grand scheme of things. If you like big barreled Imperial Stouts, I can recommend so far both of these. I expect the other twos I will as well, but the absolutely brewed a really delicious beer here. I'm liking what they're doing with changing the barrels, seeing how it changes the beer. So far, some minor changes, and on the future ones, we'll see what else changes as we go through the different barrel-aged versions of this same beer. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications, hit that bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.